The Sistine Chapel Ceiling was one of Michelangelo's great achievements, but little did he realise that his work in the chapel was far from over. I'm Grant Lewis, and welcome to my corner. In 1508, the 30-something Michelangelo Buonarroti was commissioned to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the papal chapel deep in the heart of the Vatican. This was a huge ask for any artist, let alone someone who had never actually completed a fresco before and who didn't even consider themselves a painter. Some contemporaries even alleged that jealous rivals tried to get Michelangelo to take on the commission in the hope that he'd fail, and yet he triumphed, stunning Italy with some of the most iconic works of his entire career, including the famous Creation of Adam, with its iconic reaching hands as the first man is brought to life. This extraordinary drawing is the best witness we have, documenting the process by which Michelangelo arrived at this remarkable solution. It is quintessential Michelangelo, masculine, powerful, vigorous, showing his unique ability, the thing that really excited contemporaries, to use the human body as a vehicle for expression. But the effortless command of the human body, the mastery with which this drawing is made, only tells one part of the story. Sure, we get a sense of how much planning these frescoes needed, but we don't get any flavour of the logistical headaches, the physical slog, the extreme discomfort that accompanied covering vast expanses of ceiling, even for a relatively young, brawny sculptor like Michelangelo. As he stressed at length later on, Michelangelo did not want to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling at all. Once it was finished in 1512, he probably hoped that he would never have to do any more frescoing again, and it seemed that way for the next couple of decades as Michelangelo was busy on all sorts of projects both in Rome and Florence. But in the 1530s, more than 20 years after the ceiling was finished, all that changed. After an incredibly tumultuous few years in Italy, which saw Rome sacked and Michelangelo's native city of Florence besieged, the Pope, Clement VII, a member of the Medici family, decided to find new commissions that would reassert Rome's predominance within Christian Europe. And so, in the hot summer of 1533, he turned to Michelangelo about the possibility of making a new fresco on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, which was to show the Last Judgement. This was a big ask. Just imagine having to compete against one of the great triumphs of your early career in a medium you don't particularly like. When Pope Clement died the following year, Michelangelo thought that he might be able to wriggle out of this new project, but unfortunately for him, the new Pope, Paul III, was even more enthusiastic than Clement had been, scolding Michelangelo when he suggested to the Pope that he already had enough on his plate. "I have waited 30 years to have you in my service, and I will not get my desire," the Pope is supposed to have said to him very angrily. With the Pope's mind made up, Michelangelo realised that he would have to paint it. But in addition to his hesitation about that medium, he was also taking on this huge project at, by the standards of the time, really quite an advanced age. Indeed, this is not the same Michelangelo who painted the ceiling or made this drawing. Rather, this is someone nearing 60, taking on a very, very physical task, having recently had several health scares, and who, as recently as 2 years before, had caused so much worry amongst his friends that they thought he was about to die of exhaustion. And as we'll see, painting this new fresco was not plain sailing. The Last Judgement, God's final judging of all humanity, is, to put it mildly, not a simple subject. You need Christ in the centre, judging everyone. You need his attendant saints by his side. You need angels doing his bidding, either bringing souls up from the dead to heaven, or else condemning them down to hell. And last but not least, you need a veritable menagerie of menacing-looking demons under Satan's thumb. This drawing is not at all like the Adam we saw earlier, which Michelangelo made when he had a pretty good idea of what he wanted to paint. Instead, we're looking at something from much earlier in the preparatory process, when everything is still in flux, when he's still trying to fix the rudiments of his composition. And so we see something that is in many ways much, much messier. We see ideas being laid on top of each other. we see these little breakout sketches where Michelangelo is trying to revise the pose of a figure. He is quite simply testing ideas. And when I say test ideas, I really do mean test. Because at some point, Michelangelo took the sheet, held it up to the light, and decided to trace some of the poses on the other side of the paper to see how well the poses work in reverse. In fact, he probably did this more than once because he used two different types of chalk. This is a really sustained effort in order to get exactly the composition that he wanted. You get this very exciting sense of Michelangelo just fizzing with ideas, with more ideas than he could ever use. And despite this sustained effort, most of the figures explored in this drawing were changed in some way by the time Michelangelo came to finalize his design. Michelangelo was the sort of artist who was never satisfied with anything they could create, but in this instance he probably had quite a bit of leeway to tinker, because although he received the commission in 1533, he was only ready to start painting it in 1536, and this was because the altar wall had not been prepared with the right kind of plaster that Michelangelo wanted, and so the poor workman had to take all the plaster down and start again. In order to scale up his designs to the fresco wall, he needed to make full-scale one-to-one drawings of the entire composition, drawings we call cartoons, and to get there he really had to plan pretty much everything. He began making detailed studies of every figure that was going to appear in the composition, studies in appearance and function that are quite similar to the Adam drawing from the ceiling that I showed at the beginning. Here is one for one of the souls rising from the tomb at the bottom of the fresco. Here is one for an angel punishing those heading down to hell. And here at the end we have a study for yet another angel who appears at the top, guarding the instruments of Christ's passion, the source, ultimately, of our redemption. These are real graphic tour de force, for my money some of the best surviving drawings from Michelangelo's hand, not simply for the extraordinary command of anatomy, but because he manages to conjure figures who almost seem to live and breathe. You really sense Michelangelo enjoying making these, because this is precisely what he does best, and he could make them to his heart's content with several hundred figures to prepare in the fresco. And now that his ideas had begun to fix, he could produce them in a much more orderly way than that very messy compositional study we saw earlier. He packs figures with studies for adjacent figures, figures who will appear next to each other in the fresco, as is the case with this drawing. So here, as I said, we have a figure rising from the tomb scheduled for the bottom left corner of the fresco, and if I turn it over, we find a study for the figure who appears just to the left of him in the fresco. Because with several hundred figures to draw for, one can imagine that Michelangelo quite quickly became surrounded by an awful lot of paper. Sadly, we only have these very few fragments of what must have been truly hundreds and hundreds of sheets. And even when he's gone to the effort of making these several hundred figure studies, he's still not done drawing, because as you can see, he habitually omits the heads from these studies. And so he needed to draw all of the heads as well. And for the head of one figure, he drew it on the back of the compositional study we looked at earlier, the back that is already full of several of those tracings of figures when he was testing out individual poses. By now, when he's making much more detailed studies like this, Michelangelo is ready to think about making his cartoon and finally picking up his brush. Frescoing itself took 5 years, and it's clear from the way Michelangelo painted that he did find this more of an ordeal than was the case with the ceiling. He works in smaller patches, he relies more on assistants, but slowly, bit by bit, he was able to work down the wall, and the fresco began to emerge. But not before Michelangelo had come to some harm. With the end nearly in sight, with most of the painting done, he fell off what was left of the scaffolding, hurting his legs, and he does seem to have been in quite a bad way. Friends are very, very worried about him, and it was only after a consignment of Trebbiano wine, and here I empathise entirely, that he started to recover. The finished work was unveiled in 1541, 29 years to the very day after Michelangelo had completed the ceiling. The Pope allegedly fell to his knees in wonder, but overall the fresco attracted what we might call mixed reviews. Artists were absolutely dumbfounded. Some even rushed from different parts of Italy to come and see this new work by Michelangelo, the first major new work by Michelangelo in over a decade. But others, particularly within the religious establishment, were less enthusiastic. This was, in many ways, an unconventional Last Judgement, full of many iconographic idiosyncrasies that seemed to have been, in part, Michelangelo's own invention, and they appeared in what was a very febrile religious climate in Rome as the Catholic Church tried to grapple with the Protestant Reformation. After several often quite unhappy decades in Florence, the commission of the Last Judgement prompted Michelangelo to move to Rome, something he'd wanted to do for a while. And once he was there, he was inundated with requests, and soon it became clear that he would never leave. Remarkably, he would carry on working in Rome for another 30 years after he began work on the Last Judgement, dying as busy as ever at the age of 88. And it is this late chapter of Michelangelo's life, full of extraordinary projects of all different kinds, that I'd really like to invite you to enjoy and explore in our current exhibition, Michelangelo: The Last Decades. I really hope you've enjoyed joining me for this corner, and if you'd like to buy tickets for our exhibition, click on the link here. Thank you.